mean, it's let them deal. I'm the one that got him to this position. And I think that's going to get worked out. I think we're getting close to where Russia and Ukraine should have. It's a war that should have never happened, would have never happened if I was president. But I think that's going to get worked out, yeah.
It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. That was yet another example of the United States as a superpower in decline, with a president who, instead of exercising leadership on the most important geopolitical issue of the day, throws up his hands, says, "Not my problem," and adds falsely that we never would have been in this situation if he'd been in charge. But reality is catching up to Donald Trump. He can lie all he wants about ending 8 wars. The Iranians don't care about this rhetoric. The Ukrainians and Russians don't either. The language of power still matters in international affairs. And the United States, under Trump's leadership, is impotent. On Monday, I aired part 1 of my conversation with Caolan Robertson, an Irish journalist who has covered extensively the war in Ukraine with some of the bravest reporting I have ever seen. The day before our interview, he was awarded the Order of Merit by President Zelensky for his reporting. His latest story covers the complicity of his government in Ireland in helping fund the Russian war machine. In some ways, that reporting is every bit as brave as his work on the front lines. He has received death threats for exposing how a Russian company now controls the export of the lion's share of a critical wartime resource from Ireland. Caolan has set out to prove that this raw material is winding up in Russian weapons that kill innocent Ukrainians. It's an incredible story fit for Hollywood, and it's happening right now. Here's part 2 of my conversation with Caolan Robertson. How do you think about the threats you're receiving for this kind of reporting versus the threat you experience under the skies of Kherson or out east? It's a very different kind of fear you have to live with doing this kind of reporting.
It's a very weird and surreal situation. I am desperate to get back to Ukraine because that's where I feel much safer. No, and I'm not joking. You know, I'm sure you felt the first time we went to Ukraine when there's a war going on, it was terrifying crossing that border, watching it on Google Maps, that little blue dot. And it's like, right, we're here. This is, heart rate's through the roof. My heart rate is now through the roof until I can get back to Ukraine, because at least in Ukraine, most of the Russians and the saboteurs, where they are. They're the other side of the front line. In Ireland, they're everywhere. They're owning the Russian refineries. They're in the bars and restaurants. They're in politics and media, and they're infiltrating the whole thing. There's been reports as well that shows that Ireland is now a backdoor to Russian saboteurs and Russian spies. 14,000 visas have been issued to these people. Incredibly dangerous, much safer in Ukraine, which is crazy to think about it. People are like, oh, I bet you can't wait to take a break from Ukraine and go home to peaceful Ireland. It's like, no, I can't wait to take a break from Ireland and go home to Ukraine where I can feel safe. But that's a damning indictment of how bad things have gotten and how normalized Europe has gotten. I didn't just go to Ireland as well. I went from Nikopol, I went through Venice to cover the Venice Biennale, where I confronted the Russian ambassador. Don't know if you saw this 2 weeks ago. And the fact that the Russians were back with a pavilion there. And it's how the whole of Europe are now again inviting the Russians back again, just like they did after they stole Crimea in 2014. And this is going to continue again, endlessly until it's stopped. But again, we allow Russia to steal places, invade countries, and then apologize for them, invite them back to all of our lovely, beautiful, polite events, and then act shocked when it happens again and again. And that's because, the definition of madness is to repeat the same mistakes. And that's what we're doing.
That accommodation is not reflective at all of the reality of the battlefield right now. It's almost as if European and American politics lags by a year what is actually happening in Ukraine. And it's too soon to say Ukraine is winning. I'll say it because I'm an optimist eternally when it comes to Ukraine's fight. But they are able to launch strikes deep into Russia. Their long-range sanctions program is having, that's Zelensky's term, is having a devastating effect. And you see it not just in the numbers, but in the outlook of Putin and the people around him. They are displaying a kind of paranoia we haven't seen since the very early days of the war. What is your assessment of the tactical and strategic reality in Ukraine when it comes to the war itself?
Well, it's cool that you said that. Most journalists like to pride themselves on being pessimists all the time, but actually it's good to be optimistic because that's realistic in this situation. After years in Ukraine, this feels like the first turning point where it really feels like something could happen. A second war has been launched, which is when Ukraine started building and firing their own long-range missiles. And that's a war on Russia's industrial complex and their economy. And now there's there's just a time that's left, right? Ukraine doesn't have the same manpower of Russia, but Russia cannot sustain these long-range attacks in the long term, and that means that there will be a point if these refineries keep burning that maybe if they go bankrupt, they can't pay soldiers to come to Ukraine to murder people every single day. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a few years, who knows? So it's difficult as well, right? And that is up against the reality that Ukraine cannot continue on the front lines, losing people every single day endlessly, right? Russia doesn't care about human lives. They'll just throw people into the meat grinder. But Ukraine do, and Ukraine, doesn't have the same number of people as Russia. And I think they realize that, and they're very, very realistic about it. And that's why they're hitting Russia in the way that they are. But honestly, I just have a feeling that it's going to work. And I wouldn't say that if I didn't think it was true. I wouldn't say those words, but there feels like something's different in the air. I don't know if you felt this as well when you were in Ukraine recently, but there's an electricity in the air. There's a hope. You can see it in people's faces all across the country. And you can see it in the videos that Russians are posting, with smoke rising in their back gardens every day. So, this is like unprecedented. And the humiliation, all Russia really has as well is their image on the world stage of being a big Russian bear that you should never poke. And they get Candace Owens and Andrew Tate and all the worst people on earth to go and promote that image. And now Ukraine humiliated them at the St. Petersburg conference, right? Their version of Davos, and then wrote an open letter and said, all right, is it time to give up now? I mean, this is like a great strategy. And I could see it working in some ways, because even the pro-Russians around the world are looking at that and going, that doesn't look too good. That doesn't look too strong. And then Russia starts to have those cracks of its image. So really, it's like an incredibly great strategy. Also, Russia asked Ukraine for permission to hold Victory Day parade, and they broke the ceasefire they promised. They aren't going to hold any more parades ever again. No. That's the end of that. And that was shown in their parade at St. Petersburg going up in flames. So it's interesting.
Well, that gets to the reality of this becoming a high-tech war. I mean, it was always heading in that direction. I think you made the comparison to Mad Max, and I can't remember your Blade Runner. I don't know what your high-tech version of, but I call it Terminator and World War I. It's this weird melding of two different kinds of warfare. But in the high-tech domain, Ukraine now has the edge. They are advising NATO. They are advising the Gulf states. This is more my beat than yours, but do you ever talk to people in the Ukrainian military about their emergence as a military superpower?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I asked Zelensky about this just a week after he sent people to the Gulf to rescue them and to rescue U.S. air bases. And I said, do you have the cards now? And he said, yeah. And he represents, a lot of the militaries. And he said, we're sitting here a year after you were berated at the White House for having nothing. And now, the US are asking for your help to defend their ships in the Strait. So there is definitely an acknowledgement. And I know people all across the board in Ukrainian military, from the front lines defenders all the way up to the people, the top of the government. And there has been a massive kind of change in attitude, and it's kind of it's seen through a smirk and sort of a smile in almost every conversation through having an edge, and that is like indisputable, just fact, right? You can see that everywhere.
Hey everyone, quick break to say thank you. My last trip to Ukraine was made possible by those of you who signed up for my Substack page. There's a free option too, but the paid subs, which help cover my trips, start at just $8 a month, which actually goes a lot farther than you might think given how cheap it is to sleep in a trench. I'll be going back, and I'll also be posting frequent updates from the front until then. And we've got the Meidas Defense Weekly Substack Live on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Check that out. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the Ken Harbaugh Show Substack channel. Your support is what makes all this possible. Back to the show.
But Ukraine has had to do this because they realized at a certain point when Trump came in that they were on their own in a lot of ways. Yes, they're still getting support through journalists like you and American citizens watching this, still caring about Ukraine and donating and fighting and volunteering, but direct support from the US government directly from the Trump administration. They knew that was going to stop. So they said, right, let's do and make with what we have, and we'll make it everything here. We'll innovate through the roof. And it's been insanely amazing. And I know what the reason I want to buy a house in Ukraine one day and live in Odessa is because I can see it and believe it. that when the war is over, it's going to be one of the most important places on the planet for defense, for industry, for investment, for everything. It's going to thrive. I know that for a fact. Yeah. So it's going to be incredible.
I agree. And it's not just about the economics. It's about a population that has a national mission. And so many countries in the beleaguered West and the U.S. have lost that sense of national purpose. That's the most powerful thing I perceive when I go. Of course, they have this amazing tech industry, an innovative spirit that is leapfrogging Europe, but it's really that sense of national purpose that I think is going to propel them.
Oh yeah. It's amazing to see it. And again, I'm sure you're well aware of just what that feels like as soon as you cross the border now. But the future is bright. I think it's good. And again, people would say I'm like being a Ukrainian shill for saying this or a cope or whatever. I never used to really say this, not until the last 6 months, that this really feels like a turning point. It feels bright. This is the best summer I've seen. It's amazing.
Especially after the winter that Ukraine just endured. It's almost poetic in a way. The turning point for me, and it happened very recently, was talking to Ukrainians. At the same time that our Secretary of State was on the phone with Sergei Lavrov being told to evacuate all Americans from Kyiv, what Ukrainians were saying to me, and I felt terrible saying this out loud until more than one of them gave me permission, their response has been astonishingly, bring it on. You want to launch the biggest raid on Kyiv that we've ever seen? Bring it on. The idea that this is going to cow them or break their spirit when it is having absolutely the opposite effect is just another indication of the bubble that Putin is living in. He has no idea what the resolve of the Ukrainian people will lead to, which will be the dissolution of Russia, I believe. Do you have thoughts on that? What does Russia look like in 30 years?
Oh, yeah, completely. I mean, Putin still thinks in a lot of ways that the more you bomb a population, the more likely it is that they'll be, pushed into submission because he thinks that that's what generates respect through fear. But when you bomb a thriving democracy, people that love freedom, it makes them more determined every single time an explosion happens. And that's why it's backfiring so much. And that's why people in Kherson are so resilient as well. It has the complete opposite effect. And I imagine that Russia, because people say all the time, oh, you're just a warmonger, or you want Russia annihilated and destroyed. I think that Russia is going to be economically destroyed and broken up as a state, dysfunctional. And unless it's saved by Donald Trump at the last second, which, it seems like he wants to do, or someone swoops in to try and save the day, and unless it's invited back into the civilized world again, like what happened after the Soviet Union fell, it will happen again. Again, Russia's a relatively new country. People call Ukraine new, and they say, oh, Ukraine's only 30 years old. It's not a real place. Russia is actually about 30 years old because that's when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's pretty recent that it's already shown that it's not sustainable and it can collapse under the same type of system of corruption that it was leading under. And it will collapse again. History shows that. It's a very dysfunctional country and a dysfunctional state. And again, a lot of people think that this just stops at Putin as well. Unfortunately, most of Russian society are pretty indifferent to the war, pretty indifferent to Ukrainians. I don't really have a lot of hope that someone else is going to come in as an opposition leader. So the best outcome is that it is just, as a country, not economically able to wage warfare on anyone else, and it can just be balkanized and left to themselves. They can do farming, they can do whatever they want, but they're not going to come to, there'll be no embassies and there'll be no invites into the civilized world for a while, at least. I mean, this is the only way to deal with a country that cannot stop invading and genociding everyone around it. It's been doing this for centuries. So, that's what's going to happen. I can pretty much visualize it. I've only been to Russia once. That was to Kursk with the Ukrainians. And people think that was the last time. They put me on Interpol for that. But I think I'll visit again one day once it's broken up. And, we can both just go in and have a look at how things were when it's no longer a state.
Please contextualize that for the uninitiated. How did you visit Russia again? What were the circumstances of that tourist visit?
I guess it's my first holiday without a passport. I was sitting in Sumy about a year and a half ago. The North Koreans had just arrived, and the journalists had been banned at this point. And one of the soldiers said, "Oh, you want to go to Russia?" And I laughed. And he said, "No. Do you? Tomorrow morning there's a van. We can throw you in the back if you want to go. Just don't tell anyone." I was like, okay. He's like, just leave your passport in the hotel. So, but I wanted to go and film because I knew that Russians would put out propaganda and lies once it had been taken back, right? Yeah. And they would say that all this terrible stuff happened, and I wanted to show the truth. The New York Times did a puff piece on it. But I also wanted to see what it looked like, and it was fascinating. I got to see Russians in their natural habitat. They were in their natural environment. They were looting and they were stealing and they were, robbing their own supermarkets. So that was kind of fascinating, almost like a nature documentary. But I also did a report once I had left and said, look, there are children cycling through the streets. There are houses that are all intact and people being looked after. The Russians are going to deny
by the Ukrainians.
By the Ukrainians, yeah. So that was really important to show. But I also said, the only difference is really now that it's under new rules is that they have flushing toilets now because the Ukrainians are here, thank God. So they're a little bit happier, the Russians. And they were so angry about that. They put me on Interpol, international wanted list, put me on Russia Today, constantly, said I was a terrorist, all this stuff. But, Russians don't like to be humiliated. They don't like to be laughed at. One of the most viral tweets was one of the Russians said, "How dare you come to our country? How did you get in? Who let you in?" And I posted a photo of the bombed checkpoint and said, "I don't know, the checkpoint was out of service." And they just lost it because Russians cannot stand to be humiliated because, again, it's the big bear. So that was pretty funny, actually.
That's
pretty good reporting.
Right. Well, keep it up. We'll keep following, of course, and let's figure out a way to do, something jointly with MeidasTouch. I think that would be a lot of fun.
I would love that. Yeah, okay. That sounds amazing.
Great. Thanks, Caolan. Great having you.
Thanks for having me.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.